We now turn to a story by the master storyteller Gabriel Garcia Marquez. The story is called A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings, or Un Señor Muy Viejo con Alas Enormes. It appeared in a collection of stories in 1955 called Leaf Storm and Other Stories. He emerged, that is Marquez, from a tradition that evolved from the Spanish realism of writers like Miguel Cervantes, Camilo José Cala, and Benito Pérez Galdós, to become the preeminent literary voice in what was called magical realism, a global artistic phenomenon with German and American artistic roots that bloomed especially after the Second World War in literature of Central and South America, and provided an alternative and sometimes, frankly, miraculous reality, often rooted, like Marquez's tale, in folklore, and working toward, in the story, emotional truths and far-reaching symbolic meanings. We associate this work with writers like Paraguay's Augusto Roa and Chile's Isabel Allende, Alejo Carpenter of Cuba, and Juan Rulfo, Carlos Fuentes, and Laura Esquivel of Mexico, as well as another preeminent figure in modern short fiction, Jorge Luis Borges of Argentina. The miraculous occurs in the everyday or the quotidian in many of these so-called magical realism stories, but it's often perverse, bizarre, or simply weird and fantastical, but nonetheless real. The miraculous encased in an undeniable sense of realism. Thus, in this story, a real old man appears with wings who has fallen from the heavens, but he's old and smelly and becomes a sideshow or freak show spectacle, a commercial enterprise. Born in Aracataca in Colombia in 1928, Garcia Marquez is a Nobel laureate in literature. He received the Nobel Prize in 1982, and one of the 20th century's most famous and respected writers, author of the famous novels 100 Years of Solitude, The Autumn of the Patriarch, and Love in the Time of Cholera. He was one of those writers versatile enough to write novels as well as short fiction. There are those who simply write short fiction and those who can do both, like Henry James, like Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Grace Paley, on the other hand, gave us mainly really only short stories as well as poetry, or Chekhov gave us pretty much short stories as well as drama. But Marquez was one of those versatile enough to write pretty much in all genres. He was educated, however, in the law at the Universidad Nacional in Bogota, and he was a journalist and screenwriter as well as a novelist and short story writer, and was known throughout his life as a political activist. He was raised by his maternal grandparents and strongly influenced by the supernatural and fantastical stories that his grandmother told him throughout his childhood. And he wanted to write stories in a fashion like they were told to him by his grandmother, with what he called a brick face. That's how he phrased it. And he had an early chance encounter with Kafka's The Metamorphosis, that story of Gregor Samsa which has him inexplicably turning into a cockroach or a giant dung beetle. Reading that story seemed to free Marquez, though he was also greatly influenced by the Greek dramatist and author of Oedipus Sophocles, and by the American Nobel laureate William Faulkner, who once said in a famous interview with George Plimpton that appeared in the Paris Review that the best place for a writer to live, because of the hours and the company, would be in a brothel. Well, Garcia Marquez actually lived for a while in a brothel. He also lived in Venezuela and under asylum in Mexico because of his radical activist activities. This story stretches credibility. It's really improbable, but it is within that frame of realism that follows the pattern of a dene that we've seen before. Like a hunger artist, you begin with the dene, the given that a man was a hunger artist and was performing essentially a starvation act, or Shirley Jackson's The Lottery being a dene, the dene being that people have a lottery in which somebody is singled out to be killed. This story actually begins with that given. A very old man with wings falls out of the sky into this small, nameless village, and then even more improbable things occur within that frame. However, the details and the descriptions are rooted in realism. We get back to Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the author of The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, who told us as readers we can have a willing suspension of disbelief. And when you read a story like Marquez's, you begin sort of with that notion of the willing suspension of disbelief. You become more entranced, enchanted by the story, and you're more willing to disbelieve things that really don't seem like they're happening, but nevertheless have the whole idea of verisimilitude, trueness to life, or realism around them. Fiction, remember, is itself fiction. It's not real. It's imagined. It's made up. This story certainly falls into that category, but it's also fiction that is unlikely in terms of what occurs, as we'll see, and based essentially on provincial Latin American folklore made to seem real. Why is magic realism so important with Latin writers and South American writers? Well, it has a lot to do, it seems to me, with Catholicism and the Catholic Church playing a major role, as they do in so many of these stories of magic realism. And we see them surfacing out of the rich traditions that are Catholic traditions in both Central and South America. That is, even as writers become less bound to their faith, fallen away, less Catholic in a religious sense, they still feel the sense of the miraculous in the everyday. They still feel the sense that what normally had been part of faith, maybe even part of superstition, but nevertheless attached to religion, could somehow take place in a different form. And that's almost precisely what we see in stories of magical realism. This tale is also allegorical, and it was subtitled A Tale for Children. And the allegory and the lessons that are embedded in the tale for children are really rooted in a native or indigenous folk culture and folk wisdom of Colombia, which challenged many of the authorities and leading expert and institutional figureheads, challenged the church as well. Magic realism is a term often used for works like this, or with many Latin American fiction writers and a writer like Toni Morrison, but especially relevant to the work of Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Because in his work you get this blend or this fusion of the real and the fantastic, and you get it so vividly that it's memorable, if not unforgettable. And the intrusion of the unexpected or the miraculous in everyday life is precisely what occurs in this story. This term, by the way, magic realism, has taken on some controversy. It's a subgenre. It's recognized as a subgenre throughout the literary world, but it's controversial because some argue that it's really a form of marginalizing Latin writers. Nevertheless, what we see in the story is almost, by definition, classically magic realism. It's fantastic and extraordinary, somebody with enormous wings that are literally on that somebody who is ordinary. He's a very old man. In fact, it's surmised initially he may just have been an old Norwegian sailor with wings. The real revelation in the story is how he is treated and the reactions he causes among the people of the town and those beyond who hear of him. This, like the lottery, is a story of regular folk, of common folk. And like the lottery, it brings them under a kind of surveillance and raises questions about them that are quite serious. There are elements in the story that are connected to myth. The Icarus story certainly comes to mind, the story about the man who had those wings made of wax and who got closer to the sun and the wings melted. Any stories with men who fly or who have wings are evoked by this story. And also, one thinks of wings on a man in terms of the artistic imagination, taking flight and imagining essentially what Garcia Marquez manages to imagine for us, a man with wings. He establishes that this character has real wings, that he lands in a village, and then he's ultimately sent off into flight and into being ultimately, finally, an imaginary dot on the horizon of the sea. Imaginary being, I think, the key word here. That is, the real and the imagined seem to become connected, and no longer is he a man with wings who's there as a sideshow, but he's that dot on the horizon that seems imaginary and that can only be part of memory. So the trajectory of the story is from an old man who lands and then at the end takes off and flies away. In between, a neighbor surmises that he's an angel and he's come to take the sick child of Peleo and Elisenda. On the third day of rain, they had killed so many crabs inside the house that Peleo had to cross his drenched courtyard and throw them into the sea because the newborn child had a temperature all night, and they thought it was due to the stench. The world had been sad since Tuesday. Sea and sky were a single ash-gray thing, and the sands of the beach, which on March nights glimmered like powdered light, had become a stew of mud and rotten shellfish. Notice how Marquez paints a vivid picture for us of the setting. Initially he has this sick child. Things change when This figure lands from the heavens, but nevertheless immediately kind of assaults almost our senses in this vivid way, in this picturesque way, and poetic way, and makes us realize that even the world seems sad. And suddenly, things take a turn. This creature falls out of the sky. This creature that seems so ordinary, but yet obviously was able to fly. And Peleo, the husband, the father of the child, locks him up in a chicken coop. And a priest comes, Father Gonzaga by name. He's consulted, just like the woman in the village had been consulted. In other words, you go to the authorities, you go to the people who know what this represents, that something has fallen from the sky that seems very ordinary, but has wings, old and destitute looking. And Father Gonzaga is consulted, as are members of the community who come out to what they see and ultimately believe is an angel. So, practical-minded Elizenda, the wife and mother of the child, gets the notion to charge people to see this angel. And soon, the popular interest in the angel, or a very old man who appears to be an angel, wears off and is replaced by a surge of interest in a young woman who disobeyed her parents and was punished by being turned into a tarantula. We get to the point of the story where we even accept that kind of fantastical thing. The willing of suspension of disbelief that Coleridge talked about is so manipulated by Marquez that we begin to believe a man can come out of the sky with wings, and then we believe that a child can be turned into a tarantula. Why not? In this fantastical world, in this world where things happen that are out of kilter with the real, but nevertheless seem to be real, we accept them as real. Or up to a degree we accept them as real. And at the end of the story, the angel flies off. She kept watching him even when she was through cutting the onions, and she kept on watching until it was no longer possible for her to see him, because then he was no longer an annoyance in her life, but an imaginary dot on the horizon of the sea. It's really quite compelling. I mean, this is Elizenda seeing this man who she turned into a commercial enterprise taking off and going into flight once again. And she's there chopping onions. I mean, what more ordinary than, or more real than doing that in the kitchen? But he had become an annoyance to her. In fact, she's glad to be almost good riddance where he's concerned, glad to be rid of him. And he becomes, as I said, an imaginary dot. Was he even real to begin with? Is memory real? Magical realism calls to mind all of these rather, well, sometimes fragile differences that separate the imagination from the real, and the imagination and the real from memory, and what memory can create. There are in this story, like Flannery O'Connor's A Good Man is Hard to Find, what I think we could characterize as impenetrable mysteries that occur. There's first of all the profusion of crabs that I read in the first few sentences that somehow simply take place, help contribute to making the world sad. There's the child's fever that comes and goes and abates after the angel or old man, whichever he might be, arrives. And there's also the mysteriousness of miracles that occur within the story and appear to be linked to the angel, old man, angel. And when you think about it, these miracles are rather amusing. A blind man doesn't discover his sight, but he gains 3 new teeth. A paralytic doesn't walk, but he wins the lottery. A leper's sore sprouts sunflowers. Again, you can see where we're allowing our suspension of disbelief to go. And the girl who danced all night and defied her parents and turned into a large tarantula retains her maiden's head, a joke perhaps on the word maidenhead, in a metamorphosis that could well be a salute to Kafka's The Metamorphosis. But these strange and fantastical things seem to happen almost in an ordinary way, because they do appear to happen in an ordinary way within the context of the story. And we begin to believe that just about anything can happen. The miracles are laughable because one begins to wonder, what's the nature of what we call the miraculous? Where does it come from? Is it sometimes serendipity or chance or other kinds of circumstances that turn ordinary events into miraculous events and make them seem like they've come from on high? But what are our expectations? This gets to, again, this whole impenetrable mysteriousness in this story. What are our expectations of the source of miracles? What do we attribute to the miraculous? And why do we make out of things miraculous when they simply happen in ways that perhaps are ultimately just mysterious or inexplicable? The wise woman in this story, who is, we're told is the wise woman, is a subject of satire. She declares and certifies that the old man is an angel, and we're told that she knows everything about life and death. She knows so much that she wants the angel clubbed to death and believes in celestial conspiracies. You can see where Marquez is having a good deal of fun at the expense of people who think they know it all, or the people who think those people know it all. She's convinced, for example, angels are to be fed mothballs. Where does she get that from? Well, again, satirizes a lot of what you could call common folk wisdom, or notions that come out of what we call the vulgate experience, the experience of the vulgar common people, if you will. I don't mean to be insulting of the common people here, but there is a kind of vulgarity to this whole idea that, for example, angels eat mothballs. It's ridiculous. But nevertheless, this is a woman who supposedly knows everything and can assess that he's an angel and knows about celestial conspiracies and knows that angels are supposed to eat mothballs. She can't tell Peleo and Elisenda what to do with dead angels, but she appears to be an authority on nearly anything else having to do with angels, and the folk around her believe in her. The story is really satiric of all would-be or real authority figures, right up to the papacy. The villagers are satirized in their desire to make this angel old man a world mayor. Some of them want to make him world mayor as if there were such an office, or some of the other ones want to, maybe the more thoughtful ones, one could say, make him a 5-star general. Or in the case of the visionaries, they want to make him a stud. It'd be great to breed a whole race of humans who have wings. Crowd behavior, mass behavior, is satirized in the story, as are common people who come as pilgrims for cures or thrills. Some of this really has very enlivening humor in it. But the important point here is these people are satirized in their love of spectacle and in their hunger for miracles. And also, like the people in Kafka's story, they're fickle. A young woman comes along and turns into a tarantula, and they're not as interested in the angel or the old man anymore. And they're cruel. And that particularly, I think, needs to be emphasized, because they steer brand burn the side of the angel old man. Cruelty, ignorance, these things abound among the villagers in this story. Is Garcia Marquez suggesting, with both seriousness and humor, that people can turn something that comes from heaven into hell? Well, the narrator alludes to the hellish heat from the oil and sacramental lamps. The narrator also alludes to the hell full of angels in the house, and so we get the specter of hell. And Father Gonzaga, the priest who comes to essentially assess this old man with wings, is also satirized. His notion is somehow that the old man cannot be an angel unless he speaks Latin. And the priest's appeal to the higher church authorities, also satirized. The Church of Rome and its elders, right up to and including the pontiff, have what appear to be an endless Byzantine tendency to consider matters with questions such as how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. Who really understands the meaning behind the appearance of this strange visitor? Certainly not the village wise woman, certainly not the leading lights of the village, nor even the authorities of the church. And this is also a tale of art and commerce. This angel, this old man, whatever he is, makes Peleo and Elisenda rich as a kind of sideshow freak. But he remains cooped up and underfoot, and he also brings trouble, especially with the mobs that appear. There's a revelation of a kind of mob mentality in this. Troops have to be called in to save the home of Peleo and Elisenda, even though the angel brings in enough 5-cent admissions for them to purchase a 2-story mansion. And again, there's the mob mentality of shifting its allegiances, the kind of fickleness. The crowd, like the one in The Hunger Artist, is fickle because the tarantula lady has more interest to them because she has a moral lesson to impart about the consequences of being a disobedient daughter. And that draws the crowds that crushed the angel old man in popularity and also relieves Father Gonzaga of his insomnia and makes Pelayo's courtyard once again empty. Why is a moral lesson of a non-dutiful daughter more important to the crowd? Because, once again, you can see Marquez's sure hand here satirizing how important authority is to the people of the village. The girl turned into a tarantula is also a storyteller, and she can tell her tale. That draws the people in. The angel old man speaks in a dialect that no one understands. Her story is one of brimstone and punishment. And she doesn't appear haughty or arrogant as the old man, the angel seems to, or at least as the villagers appear to perceive him. So we have a kind of ridicule here of what people want and how quickly changeable the nature of what they're willing to pay for is. In fact, when the old man first comes on the scene, the old man with the wings, and people are paying and making Pelayo and Elisenda rich, there's a carnival that tries to, well, get some of the action, as it were. And they send someone over with wings. But it's not the same thing, because they're not real wings. The old man has real wings, again, rooted in realism. And so he's of much more interest. But because he talks in what sounds like a Norwegian dialect, and he doesn't have a story to tell, even though they assume that he's an angel because the wise woman says he's an angel, and even though they're drawn to him and they're finding cures and miracles of all kinds of twisted and bizarre, fantastical sorts, perverse sorts even, funny when we read them, they're drawn to the tarantula woman because something new, something different. And their changes, their tastes are mutable and carnivalesque and can be essentially brought back to something different because it has a moral lesson. This is a very powerful story, and readers traditionally have been charmed by the humor in the story, but realizing also that the story has something quite profound to convey, as great stories generally do, about human nature, about the mysteriousness of nature itself, and about the varying human forms and shapes that in many ways remain mysterious, remain beyond our ken. The details in this story are sensory, they're compelling, especially the disgusting ones that are associated with the angel old man. He has a dung heap smell, the scent of dung, and also lunar dust. It's funny how when we begin to find things credible that seem on the face of them to be incredible, we accept their credibility. The fact that he has lunar dust on him, for example, it's a wonderful touch by Marquez. Or just the fact that he'll eat only eggplant mush. Now, why is that? That's good. Why does he only like eggplant mush? These are the kind of details that are rooted in realism, but nevertheless remain in some ways mysterious. Even the chickens are fascinated. Are chickens normally fascinated? Can you look at a chicken and see whether it's fascinated? But Marquez tells us in the story that even the chickens are fascinated at this pitiful man who looked more like a decrepit hen. He's pathetic. Aside from being likened to a decrepit hen, he's also described as being like a senile vulture, and his wings, we're told, are buzzard wings. All of these things in his general decrepit state and the sadness and pathos in his being branded make him into an object of pathos. Pitiful figure. But why does he have wings? Where did he come from? What's his story? Well, Marquez's story is much more based in satire, Juvenalian, Swiftian, that is to say both instructive and critical. He has some moralizing to do here. He has a tale that he wants to tell, but also a tale that succeeds in doing what the great Roman poet and satirist Horace said great literature needs to do. It entertains as well as instructs us. The story has a charm of a folk tale, because it is based on a folk tale, with much to convey about the stupidity and cruelty of human beings, and also a great deal to say about the foolishness of authority and the lack of wisdom of authority as one goes higher into institutional authority, particularly in this case, the church. The story suddenly shifts by providence and brings the traveling show and the woman who's been changed into a tarantula, and dramatizes in that sense again how unpredictable fate can be. Because everything seems to be sort of angel old man centric. Then suddenly it shifts. It's not only a question of different taste and the fickleness of the masses who are coming to see these various kinds of sideshows. It tells us what people's tastes are like, too, and how those tastes can be appealed to. But it also tells us how unpredictable life can be. An angel can fall. A tarantula woman can come to town. These things seem to happen, again, within the boundaries and borders of realism. And though the doctor who examined the angel concludes that the wings on him appear so natural that he, the doctor, can't understand why other men don't have them, the very old man has been declared an angel, and that's how he is ultimately designated by the narrative voice, as well as by those who come in contact with him. His wings suggest the miraculous, but there ultimately seems to be, as is generally true of magical realism, no way to separate the miraculous from the ordinary, from the everyday. No way to separate the fantastical from the real. In the end, the very old man may simply be what the story's title says he is, a very old man with enormous wings. Though it should be noted that Garcia Marquez years later co-wrote a screenplay based on this story of his, and interestingly enough made the old man into a con man. The story has universal appeal to both children and adults. Marquez's brand of magical realism in the story and other work of his influenced a host of writers, including Carlos Fuentes, Octavio Paz, Isabel Allende, and Toni Morrison. Magical realism, though rooted in Central and South American fiction, is really quite cosmopolitan. It can be seen in the work of writers like Salman Rushdie, originally from India, but of course who settled in the UK, and Angela Carter, another British writer. And the rising sense of existentialism that we see in a story like this famous one by Marquez about a lone and isolated, forlorn, fallen from the sky, but nevertheless human creature, has parallels in the work of other leading South American writers of short fiction, such as Argentina's Julio Cortázar and Peru's Mario Vargas Llosa. What I want to emphasize here is what we've seen from post-World War II developing as a greater sense of secularism and of rising existential awareness of the loneness of human beings, and what could feel more forlorn and alone than a figure like the one in this story, a man who has fallen and who is extraordinary and different and yet suffering and old and decrepit in very human ways, and all that is projected onto him by the people being quite revelatory as well. This is human, but it also borders on a sense of existentialism, which brought us into the whole realm of the absurdity of life that we associate with a philosopher and writer like Albert Camus, who has Sisyphus in the myth of Sisyphus just rolling a stone up the hill and having it catapult him down, and rolling it up again and having it catapult him down over and over again. Or the sense of being in nothingness that we get in a writer like Sartre. A lot of these ideas grew out of philosophy that was attached to philosophers like Nietzsche, Heidegger, who began to really doubt the whole idea of the existence of God and challenge traditional forms of religious belief. And so we get a sense of that in this story. We get a sense of not only the existentialism that really is typified by characters who are alone, who have to find an identity, who have their identity put on them by others, placed on them by, in this case, a whole village. But that village itself, in its cruelty, in its harshness, reminiscent of the lottery, brings us back to this post-World War II mood of what humans are capable of. A very dark kind of mood. Nevertheless, this is a story that is leavened by its amusement factor, by the fact that we can extend our imaginations and move beyond the story into really another realm. Just imagining what this old man is and what he represents and where he came from is part of the charm of the story. Unlike a story by Bernard Malamud called Angel Levine, where a black Jew who is an angel suddenly appears, we are never really certain that this very old man is an angel. We're going to continue into the world of fantasy and the miraculous next with a fantastical story by Jewish-American author Bernard Malamud, which is steeped in Yiddishkeit and Jewish folklore and Jewish tradition about a Jewbird, written by an award-winning novelist and short story writer of the post-World War II period. If a very old man with enormous wings can inexplicably land in a village in South America, in Colombia, well, why not a Jew bird in an apartment in First Avenue in New York City? That's next.